Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Josue. I know most of y'all know me. So for this semester's paper, I chose to write about U.S. and China trade relations. There's a screen. I tried to do a PowerPoint to put it on my TV. I know it's a little hard to see, but it kind of gives a general context of what I'm talking about, what areas I'm touching up on, and so you're not completely lost in what I'm trying to talk about. So I chose this topic because it's quite recent in the news, very controversial. It's been going on for 4 years now, and it possibly can go on even further on whoever wins the presidency in 2020 and so forth. And prior to the coronavirus, it was actually a policy that the current administration has been following. And has devolved a lot of attention to it. However, it has been halted because of the current pandemic worldwide. So yes. All right, so in today's agenda, we're going to be talking about historical context, U.S. trade relations, what caused the trade deficit, trade under the current administration, what now, and then a conclusion. So we're going to be exploring each of these topics. Obviously, there's three topics. The U.S. trade relations is kind of more inside. The historical context gives a generalization of U.S. foreign trade policy. This is vital to understand that a lot of the policies that the Trump administration have taken is not brand new to international relations, is not brand new to foreign policy or U.S. foreign policy. Past administrations, the government as a general has taken, Congress has taken actions on both party lines, Democrat or Republican. But this one is a little different because it is actually tedious and more contagious than other past relations between the U.S. and other countries. All right, so some historical context, U.S. foreign trade policy. All right, so we start off with the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which was passed right after the stock market crash in 1929. It was a way to protect American goods from entering the United States. President Herbert Hoover tried to do so. Some economists argue that this passage of this law reduced government expenditures and it increased government expenditures and it reduced the budget because there was not a lot of goods entering the United States. So this is kind of where you see some protectionist moves taken by previous administrations. The next one we have is during World War II, the United States, in terms of trade and imports and exports, took some heavy measures against the Japanese. In the early stages, it put economic sanctions and it restricted embargoes on Japanese goods like iron, brass, copper, and so forth. And one of the main purposes it was because the government was trying to, under the FDR administration, was trying to protect U.S. goods in the region and also to halt Japanese aggression throughout the Southwest Asian area and the Pacific as well. So it's kind of policies built up on policies. In 1970, under President Nixon, you had the end of the U.S. dollar convertibility from gold, so it's no longer backed by gold. There was a variety of reasons why the administration decided to take those measures alongside with the Federal Reserve. One of the reasons that fits into this is in terms of trade and foreign investment and foreign policy is that the administration was trying to make sure American products were not disadvantaged to foreign exchange rates. So in other words, that if they were, because gold had a certain price and our currency was back to that, other nations were not doing that. So the U.S. government was trying to make sure that when we export products out of the United States, they had a fair fight against other nations. Next, we have the Montreal Plaza Accord of 1985, and the main purpose of it is during that time you see a rise in Japanese products, exports on computers, high technological advancements that paid good jobs, that were good paying jobs, and facilitated opportunities for the Japanese people. So to counter this, the U.S. government passed this law or agreed to this law, and basically what it did is it devalued the U.S. dollar to the yen. So it took protectionist moves against the Japanese currency to make our products more competitive with them. So this is some policies that you see the Chinese administration taking to counter the United States, and we'll get into some of that because during the trade war, the United States and China have been doing that. Next, you have the North American Free Trade Agreement. Obviously, this is the big main one that President Trump has been very vocal, has expressed main concerns about. And basically, it opened up markets and allowed the excesses of free goods from coming in from Mexico and Canada. Economists on both sides argued that it helped both Mexico and Canada and the United States because it introduced new goods to America. For instance, avocados were a product that was no longer taxed when entering and through the ports. During that same era, in the 1980s, this was kind of under the Bush administration, you also had the Congress put restrictions on and tariffs on Japanese electronics and other goods to protect manufacturing in the United States. And once again, the Free Trade Area of the Americas, the FTAA, and the Asian Pacific Economic Cooperation was another deal that was actually being negotiated under Bill Clinton. However, there was pushback from Congress. What is interesting about this, when I was conducting some research, is that Democrats actually opposed many of these things. Many Democrats that were representing states like Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, that Rust Belt area that President Donald Trump won in 2016. And so, yeah, so that's just a little historical context, just to give an idea that what current policies that the administration has taken is not. I mean, there are some general aspects that are different, but it's not brand new to foreign policy, foreign trade policy. So now we're into U.S. trade relations. What caused the trade deficit? So there's a variety of aspects that caused this dichotomy, but one of the primary aspects was the Americans love cheap products. We all know that. We all like it. I mean, computers, that obviously that's produced somewhere else, but we like cheap products. A lot of products you buy from Walmart are very cheap and they're affordable. And so companies took them there where there's no wage regulations, there's no labor regulations, and so forth. So the government, our companies took them there. And in some ways, they're exploiting people in that general area, not just in China, but in the Asian area. But this facilitated millions of individuals out of poverty. So there was some good ramifications that came out of this. A lot of Chinese were taken out of poverty. However, it hurt manufacturing. Ever since the passing of NAFTA, 5+ million manufacturing jobs were lost in the Rust Belt area, which was one of the reasons that led to President Trump's victory. In 1980, when Ronald Reagan, he kind of had the same policies trying to urge, and so forth. And so you see really in the 90s kind of this deficit start to grow. In 2006, from 1990 to 2006, there was a $307 billion deficit. Obviously, the number's way different now, and so forth. So that was one of the reasons. The next reason is China is to understand the trade deficit. You need to understand Chinese domestic policies. And one of the policies that they took is, it's a very, I want to say, is really tedious, and it's very something that a communist regime would do. So at that time, in the early 90s, the government paid off a lot of non-performing loans. So a lot of private banks in China, well, banks that were owned by the government, because it is still a communist regime, paid off a lot of the debt, a lot of non-performing loans, what they call them. And this allowed the Chinese banks to receive money from which they could fund the consumptions. So in a way, they were paying off loans from banks, the government was, so it could save itself. From there, the Chinese government stopped investing in social welfare nets like Social Security, Medicare, things that you find in industrialized nations or advanced democratized nations. But obviously China is not, so they didn't invest into that. This forced Chinese citizens to save their money and put it in these banks that were bailed out by the Chinese government. And they were saving all this money. And so since they didn't have money because they had to save it for their retirement, for healthcare emergencies, and so forth, they were not spending like here in America that we have a little flexibility to do that. And so when household consumption goes down, this hurts the economy in general, and that typically that does happen in a free market like the United States or in Europe and so forth, or in Canada. However, the Chinese got smart because it's still a state-run economy, and they started import products. So all the Chinese people that were working were making products to be exported, and they were not being bought by the household individuals in those countries. So it was a way to keep down this rate so it could export more. And this gave an apparatus for Chinese imports coming into the United States and worldwide, not just obviously in America, but it was kind of a way to manipulate the system and a way to force its own citizens not to purchase the products, but to be purchased by other nations. This gave an aggregate rise in the Chinese economy, gave more money for the government in terms of the budgeting and so forth, and invested more in the military and so forth. And then now you're starting to see some transitional offsets, like China is investing in, they call it the transcontinental railroad, what the United States went through in the 1800s is what China is doing now. So they kind of manipulated the system and the economy to offset the government itself. So it was kind of in my perspective, it's a rigged policy. And so this kind of led to a huge deficit. Americans demanded products. Chinese, hey, we have all these products because we're producing, because we have 1.2 billion people in our country, get 4. And they're sold it off to our markets. So obviously there's other factors that to take into consideration. Obviously, in the 90s, you had China entering the World Trade Organization, which is a institution. If we study liberalism in our classes, an institution to regulate trade and commerce globally, because we are a globalized economy. But China is also not playing up to those factors, and we'll get to some of the issues that President Trump and the current administration have been trying to address. So this is a little chart. I know it's hard to see, but I'm sorry about that. It's hard to see, but basically China's products. This is China right here, and U.S. and other products entering the United States. So you see in like 90s starts to rise, comes down, and it starts going back up, and obviously it's still rising to this day. So to understand this, we need to understand the current situation. So we have a few dates. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Obviously, it's been 4 years, so I try to pick some important days. And when President Trump was still candidate Trump at the time, he was very vocal. In fact, one tweet he said is the World Trade Organization enabled the greatest job death in American history. So he very critical of the World Trade Organization, obviously very realist approach, does not like world institutions and so forth. The countries kind of went back, and Trump's a lot of tweets kind of gave rise to the Chinese government to pay attention more to this new individual. On July 19, 2017, the two countries decided to meet. So before we started getting into the tariffs, the two countries decided to meet. However, there was no agreements. And this is when President Trump was elected into office. On January 22nd is where we actually start to see the trade war happen, and you have President Trump place tariffs on imported washing machines and solar panels coming from China. The Chinese government retaliated. A few months later after that, the Chinese Trump administration went further and put a 10% tariff on steel imports and a 10% on aluminum. So the Chinese government retaliated and placed a 25% on 128 products imported into China. The next day, so this was just going back and forth, so our timeline kind of starts going in there. Secretary Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, put a 25% increase on $50 billion worth of Chinese goods. The next day, the Chinese government retaliated and put $50 billion worth of tariffs on U.S. goods. And then on December 1st, both countries put a 90-day halt on new tariffs. Nothing happened. The next few months, each country waited a few months, like 2 months, and then after that, once again, tariffs started going back and forth. And on August 5th, 2019, there's actually another aspect that President Trump has been underlining, is the Chinese government uses its monetary policy to devalue its currency, like the U.S. did in 1985. to knocking off the US dollar, so making their products cheaper, and so therefore hurting US imports going into that nation. And then finally, on September 4, 2019, both nations decided to resume talks. And obviously, we're here now and we've entered to phase one of the trade agreements that have been made with the coronavirus that has come to a halt. What now? So what actions can the Trump administration say? So if public opinion shows that 72% of Americans actually are concerned that it's hurting their local economy, however, 63% of Americans see China as a rival against the United States. So there's kind of like some mixed feelings about it, how you should approach. And some policies, and obviously we've been studying DIME, and the Trump administration should use this as a central base to approach the issue. Diplomatically, the U.S. should use its allies, so approach it in more of a liberal approach, and not use its allies to be more agile against China, making sure that they stop this unfair trade policies. And one aspect that China's been able to get away with is in the World Trade Organization. China's still considered a developing nation, so they're able to do certain things that a developed nation is not. So the U.S. uses diplomatic power to get other nations to talk and start and classify it as a developed nation, so new rules can be imposed on China. Information. The United States should pass stronger laws to protect intellectual property. Chinese government is notorious at doing this and stealing patent laws and all this and creating it in China. Like I said, if we can classify China as a developed nation, there's other laws that can be prevented, not to mention domestic law that can force China to start playing by the rules of the game. Military. Obviously, we've seen a buildup of military aggression in the Southwest Asian Sea, with China building islands and so forth. The U.S. Navy, which we already have a lot of naval ships on that area, should be more active in that area. We should stop preventing it alongside with our partners like Japan and so forth. I know with TPP, which is Trans-Pacific Partnership, that was one of the items that was trying to facilitate. However, there was a lot of concerns and a lot of pushbacks on that. And then finally, economics. Obviously, like one of them is classify China as a currency manipulator like it did. We saw in our timeline and so forth. And yeah. All right, so some conclusions and what the future holds. The coronavirus. New reports are coming out daily suggesting that, this came from China, the Chinese downplayed it. Obviously, this is a domestic policy that's been issued, that an argument, whoever takes the baton next in 2020 is going to have to deal with this question. What is going to happen? Are we going to put more tariffs? Is the Trump administration policy going to be carried on? I mean, it's not just overnight it's going to change. I mean, Trump administration still follows some of the Obama administration policies. The Obama administration still follows some of the Bush administration policies. So there's no real telling. So there's no really predicting the future. And one of the questions I say is, will it lead to an economic war? Based on the analysis, the data collected, I say that it might not. It just depends on what else is foreseeall in the future. So if you have any questions, please email me or something, or text me if you have my number, and I'll be glad to answer them. All right, thank you everyone. Have a good day.